architect of inflation. Your successor, Arthur Burns, was just as eloquent, made exactly the same kinds of statements, as effectively, and again, over and over again, said the Federal Reserve will not be the architect of inflation. His successor, Mr. G. William Miller, made the same speeches and the same statements and the same protestations. His successor, Paul Volcker, he is making the same statements. Now, my question to you is, why is it that there has been such a striking difference between the excellent pronouncements of all chairmen of the Fed? Therefore, it's not personal on you. You have a lot of company, unfortunately, for the country. Why is it that there's been such a wide diversion between the excellent pronouncements on the one hand and what I regard as a very poor performance on the other?
Because monetary policy is not the only element. Fiscal policy is equally important.
You're shifting the buck to the treasurer.
Yes.
To the Congress. We'll get to Mr. Brown.
Yeah, that's
don't worry.
Right. The relationship of fiscal policy to monetary policy is one of the important things.
Could you just remind us, the general audience, when you say fiscal policy, what you mean in distinction to monetary policy?
Well, taxation, raising revenue.
And spending.
And spending.
And deficits.
And deficits, yes, exactly. And I think that you have to realize that when I've talked for a long time about the independence of the Federal Reserve, that's independence within the government, not independence of the government. And I've worked consistently with the Treasury to try to see that the government is financed. Now this gets back to spending. The government says they're going to spend a certain amount, and then it turns out they don't spend that amount. It doubles.
The job of the Federal Reserve is not to run government spending. It's not to run government taxation. The job of the Federal Reserve is to control the money supply. And I believe, frankly, I have always believed, as you know, that these are excuses and not reasons for
well, that's where you and I differ, because I think we would be irresponsible if we didn't take into account the needs and what the government is saying and doing. I think if we just went on our own irresponsibly, I say it on this because I was in the Treasury before I came to the Fed, and I know the other side of the picture. I think we'd be rightly condemned by the American people and by the electorate.
Every central bank in this world, including the German central bank, including the Federal Reserve System, has the technical capacity to make the money supply do over a period of 2 or 3 or 4 months, not daily, but over a period has the technical capacity to control it.
Dr.
They have not,
is that right?
You cannot explain the kind of excessive money creation that has occurred in terms of the technical incapacity of the Federal Reserve System or the German Central Bank or the Bank of England or any other central bank in the world.
I wouldn't say technically we are incapable of doing that, although we have never succeeded in controlling the money supply month by month.
That's right.
But I would say we can technically control it half-yearly, from one half-year period to the next, and that would be sufficient for controlling inflation.
It's like
However,
it doesn't move.
I'm an economic scientist, and I'm trying to observe phenomena, and I observe that every Federal Reserve chairman says one thing and does another. I don't mean he does, the system does.
Yeah. How different is your setup in Germany? You've heard this problem of governments getting committed to spending and the Fed having one way or the other to accommodate itself to it. Now, what's your position on this very interesting problem?
We are very independent of the government, but on the other hand, we are an advisor of the government, also on their budget deficits. And they would not easily go before Parliament with a deficit in their budget which is openly criticized and disapproved by the central bank. Why? Because we have a tradition in our country that we can also publicly criticize the government on this account. And second, if, as has happened in our case too, the government goes beyond what is tolerable for the sake of overall equilibrium, we have let it come through in the capital markets. That is to say, they have driven up interest rates. That has drawn public criticism, and that has had some effect on their attitude.
I think that's a very important point that Dr. Eminger just made, because there is not a one-to-one relationship between government deficits and what happens to the money supply at all. The pressure on the Federal Reserve comes indirectly. It comes because large government deficits if they are financed in the general capital market, will drive up interest rates, and then we have the Wright-Patmans in Congress and their successors pressuring the Federal Reserve to enter in and finance the deficit by printing money as a way of supposedly holding down interest rates. Now, before I turn to Mr. Brown and ask him that, I just want to make one point which is very important. The Federal Reserve's activities in trying to hold down interest rates have put us in a position where we have the highest interest rates in history. It's another example of the difference between the announced intentions of a policy and the actual result. But now I want to come to Clarence Brown and ask him, shift the buck to him and put him on the hot seat for a bit. The government spending has been going up rapidly, Republican administration or Democratic administration. This is a nonpartisan issue. It doesn't matter. Right. Government deficits have been going up rapidly, Republican administration or Democratic administration. Why is it that here again you have the difference between pronouncements and performance? There is no congressman, no senator who will come out and say, I am in favor of inflation. There is not a single one who will say, I am in favor of big deficits. They'll all say, we want to balance the budget, we want to hold down spending, we want an economical government. How do you explain the difference between performance and talk on the side of Congress?
Well, first, I think we have to make one point. I'm not so much with the government as I am against it.
I understand.
As you know, I'm a minority member of Congress.
Again, I'm not directing this at you personally.
I understand, of course. And while the administrations, as you mentioned, Republican and Democratic administrations, have both been responsible for increases in spending, at least in terms of their recommendation, it is the Congress, and only the Congress, that appropriates the funds and determines what the taxes are. The President has no authority to do that, and so one must lay it at the feet of the U.S. Congress. Now, I guess we'd have to concede that it's a little bit more fun to give away things than it is to withhold them, and this is the reason that the Congress responds to a general public that says, well, I want you to cut everybody else's program but the one in which I am most particularly interested. Save money, but incidentally my wife is taking care of the orphanages, and so let's try to help the orphanages, or whatever it is. Let me try to make a point, if I can, however, on what I think is a new spirit moving within the Congress, and that is that inflation as a national affliction is beginning to have an impact on the political psychology of many Americans. Now, the Germans, the Japanese, and others have had this terrific post-war inflation. The Germans have been through it twice, after World War I and World War II, and it's a part of their national psyche. But we are affected in this country by the Depression. Our whole tax structure is built on the Depression. The idea of the tax structure in the past has been to get the money out of the mattress, where it went after the banks failed in this country and jobs were lost, and out of the woodshed or the tin box in the backyard, get it out of there and put it into circulation, get it moving, get things going. And one of the ways to do that was to encourage inflation, because if you held on to it, the money would depreciate. And the other way was to tax it away from people and let the government spend it. Now there's a reaction to that, and people are beginning to say, wait just a minute, we're not afflicted as much as we were by depression, we're now afflicted by inflation, and we'd like for you to get it under control. Now you can do that in another way, and that without reducing the money supply radically. I think the Joint Economic Committee has recommended that we do it gradually. But the way that you can do it is to reduce taxes and the impact of government, that is the weight of government, and increase private saving so that the private saving can finance some of the debt that you have.
There is